The summer of 1851 in Georgia arrived with a heat so oppressive that even the cicadas seemed to protest less loudly than usual. On the Thornhill Plantation, located 30 miles west of Savannah, the cotton fields stretched endlessly under a sun that showed no mercy. The air hung thick and still, carrying the scent of red clay and sweat. 217 souls lived on that land, bound by chains both literal and invisible, working from dawn until the last light faded from the sky. Among them was a woman named Clara, 28 years old, whose hands bore the permanent stains of cotton and whose eyes carried a depth that unsettled even the overseers who claimed to own her time, her labor, her very existence. Clara had arrived at Thornhill 7 years earlier, sold away from a smaller farm in South Carolina after her previous owner died, and his debts scattered his property like autumn leaves. She had left behind a mother whose face she could barely remember now, and a younger brother whose name she whispered in the dark of the quarters every night before sleep came. On Thornhill she worked in the big house, which meant she moved between two worlds, the suffocating grandeur of the Thornhill family's daily life and the cramped, sweltering quarters where she and 60 other enslaved people tried to carve out moments of humanity between endless days of labor. The Thornhill family consisted of Master Edmund Thornhill, a man of 52 whose face had grown harder with each passing season, his wife Margaret, who spent her days pretending the source of her comfort did not exist, and their 3 children, Thomas, 24, who had recently returned from 2 years in Charleston learning the cotton trade, Elizabeth, 19, whose piano music drifted through open windows on summer evenings, and young William, just 14, who watched everything with eyes too knowing for his age. The family lived in a white-columned house that gleamed in the Georgian sun, surrounded by magnolia trees that provided shade but no relief from the moral rot that festered beneath the surface of their genteel existence. Clara's days began before sunrise. She would wake in the quarters, a long wooden building divided into small rooms where families tried to maintain dignity in spaces barely large enough to lie down in. She shared her room with 2 other women, Ruth, who worked in the laundry, and Hannah, who tended the vegetable gardens that fed both the big house and the quarters. The 3 women had developed a silent language over the years, communicating through glances and subtle gestures, what could never be spoken aloud in a place where walls had ears, and loyalty could be purchased with an extra ration of salt pork. By the time the first pale light touched the horizon, Clara would already be in the big house kitchen, helping old Esther prepare breakfast for the family. Esther had been at Thornhill for 43 years, having arrived as a girl of 12. Her hands moved with the precision of decades, kneading dough, stoking fires, and managing the complex choreography of feeding a wealthy family that never once considered the labor required to maintain their comfort. Esther rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and carefully controlled rage. On the morning of July 14th, Clara arrived at the kitchen to find Esther already working, her dark hands covered in flour, her face set in its usual expression of neutral efficiency. The kitchen blazed with heat from the wood-burning stove, adding to the already stifling summer temperature. Clara tied her headscarf more tightly and began slicing bread for toast, falling into the familiar rhythm of morning preparations. Through the open door, she could see the sky beginning to lighten, streaks of pink and orange spreading across the darkness like spilled paint. Master Edmund came down for breakfast at precisely 6:30, as he did every morning. He sat at the head of the long dining table, while Clara and another house servant named Joseph brought out platters of eggs, ham, grits, biscuits, and preserves. The master ate in silence, reading a newspaper that had arrived from Savannah 3 days earlier. His wife joined him 20 minutes later, moving through the room like a ghost, her pale hands folding and refolding her napkin. Neither of them acknowledged the people who served them, treating Clara and Joseph as invisible mechanisms of comfort, no more worthy of recognition than the furniture. The morning passed in its usual pattern of controlled chaos. After breakfast came the cleaning of the dining room, the washing of dishes, the preparation of the midday meal, to add the endless maintenance that a house of such size demanded. Clara moved through these tasks with practiced efficiency, her mind drifting to places far beyond the walls that contained her body. She thought of the stories Ruth had told the previous night about a woman 3 plantations over who had managed to escape north, following the drinking gourd in the sky until she reached people who would help her continue the journey toward freedom. Ruth had heard the story from her cousin, who had heard it from a field hand who traveled between plantations delivering messages for the masters, carrying other messages in the coded language of people who lived under constant surveillance. By noon, the heat had become almost unbearable. The air shimmered above the cotton fields where men, women, and children moved in long rows, their fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls, their backs bent under the merciless sun. From the big house windows, Clara could see the overseers on horseback, moving slowly along the edges of the fields, watching for any pause in the work, any sign of exhaustion that might justify the crack of a whip. The sound carried across the distance, sharp reports that made Clara's stomach clench even though she had heard them thousands of times before. That afternoon, Mrs. Margaret called Clara to her bedroom to help with the weekly mending. The room smelled of lavender water and the peculiar mustiness that came from keeping windows closed against the heat while burning candles to mask other odors. Mrs. Margaret sat in a velvet chair that must have cost more than the combined value of 10 human beings, according to the ledgers Master Edmund kept in his study. She held a piece of embroidery, her pale fingers pushing the needle through fabric with the kind of delicate precision that came from never having done work that left calluses. Clara sat on a low stool and began mending a tier in one of Elizabeth's dresses, a confection of white cotton and lace that had probably been damaged during some frivolous activity. Clara could only imagine. As she worked, Mrs. Margaret talked, her voice a steady stream of trivial observations about the weather, the quality of the latest fabric shipment from Charleston, the inadequacy of the piano teacher, who came twice weekly to instruct Elizabeth. Clara made appropriate sounds of acknowledgement at the required intervals, having learned years ago that white people often wanted nothing more than the illusion of conversation, a sympathetic audience for thoughts they would never direct to their equals. But then Mrs. Margaret said something that made Clara's hands pause in their work. She mentioned that Master Edmund had been meeting with other plantation owners to discuss concerns about unrest. There had been rumors, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, of plots and schemes among the enslaved population. Some owners had even increased their patrols at night, worried about fires and sabotage. Master Edmund had assured her there was nothing to worry about at Thornhill, that their people were loyal. But Mrs. Margaret confessed she sometimes woke in the night feeling uneasy, sensing something she could not name. Clara kept her face carefully neutral, her fingers resuming their work on the dress. She made a soft sound of sympathy, but inside her heart had begun to beat faster. She knew about the meetings Mrs. Margaret mentioned, not because anyone had told her directly, but because information moved through the quarters, like water through cracks in stone, finding its way around every obstacle. There were no plots at Thornhill, at least none that Clara knew of, but the very fact that the masters were worried revealed their fundamental understanding of the truth, that the system they had built rested on nothing more substantial than force and fear, and that every person they enslaved represented a potential threat to their carefully constructed world. That evening, after the dinner dishes had been washed and put away, after the fires had been banked and the big house had settled into its nightly routine, Clara walked back to the quarters under a sky dense with stars. The quarters came alive after dark in ways impossible during daylight hours. People gathered in small groups outside the long wooden buildings, their voices kept low but animated, sharing news and stories, making plans for the next day, finding moments of laughter in circumstances designed to crush the human spirit. Children ran between the buildings despite their exhaustion, playing games passed down through generations, their joy a form of resistance against a world that tried to deny them childhood. Clara found Ruth and Hannah sitting outside their shared room, and she joined them on the rough wooden bench someone had built from scrap lumber. Ruth was telling Hannah about a conversation she had overheard in the laundry that afternoon. One of the field hands had been brought to the big house to help move some furniture, and he had mentioned to another worker that tensions were high in the fields. The cotton crop was behind schedule due to the extreme heat, and Master Edmund had been pressuring the overseers to push the workers harder. Several people had collapsed from heat exhaustion in recent days, and there was talk of extending the work hours even further into the evening to make up for lost time. The field hand had spoken carefully, aware that walls had ears, but the message was clear. People were reaching their breaking point. Hannah listened with her characteristic quiet intensity. She was older than Clara and Ruth, perhaps 40, though it was hard to tell with certainty. Life on a plantation aged people in ways that had nothing to do with years. Hannah had been at Thornhill longer than almost anyone except Esther, and she had seen things she rarely spoke about: punishments, separations, deaths, both slow and sudden. She carried her knowledge like a heavy sack, visible in the set of her shoulders and the lines around her eyes. When Ruth finished speaking, Hannah nodded slowly and said what they all knew but rarely voiced aloud: that something had to break eventually. That pressure building with no release would find its own way out. Clara told them about her conversation with Mrs. Margaret, about the meetings among the plantation owners and their fears of unrest. Ruth snorted softly at this, a sound that conveyed volumes about what she thought of masters afraid of the people they terrorized daily. But Hannah's expression turned more serious. She said that fear made men dangerous, that scared masters might tighten their control even further, increase patrols, impose harsher punishments for minor infractions. They needed to be careful, to keep their heads down and avoid drawing attention. These were not new warnings, they had all lived by these rules their entire lives, but Hannah's tone suggested she sensed something shifting. Some change in the air that made old cautions even more necessary. The three women sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the quarters settling into night. Someone was singing in one of the other buildings, a low, mournful melody that seemed to capture everything they could not say directly. A baby cried, and a mother's voice murmured comfort in the darkness. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance, possibly the patrol dogs that the overseers used to track anyone who tried to run. The sounds were so familiar that they formed a kind of backdrop to existence, noticed only when they changed or disappeared. Clara felt exhaustion settling into her bones, the accumulated weight of another day spent in careful performance of subservience, while maintaining some core of self that remained untouched by the daily degradation. She thought about what Hannah had said, about pressure building with no release. She thought about the fear in Mrs. Margaret's voice when she spoke of unrest and plots. She thought about the field hands collapsing in the cotton rows and the sound of whips cracking across the distance. And she thought about something she had not yet mentioned to Ruth and Hannah, something that had happened the previous night that had left her feeling unsettled. She had dreamed of fire. Not the controlled fires of cooking hearths and warming stoves, but wild flames that consumed everything in their path, turning the world orange and red and black. In the dream, she had stood in the quarters watching the big house burn, flames shooting from every window, the white columns blackening and crumbling. She had felt the heat on her face and heard the roar of destruction, and through it all, she had felt something she rarely allowed herself to experience, a fierce, savage joy at seeing the symbol of her oppression reduced to ash and memory. Clara had woken from the dream, with her heart racing, uncertain whether she felt more disturbed by the violence of the images or by her own reaction to them. She had not mentioned the dream to anyone, knowing that such things could be dangerous even in the relative privacy of the quarters. Dreams could be interpreted as wishes, and wishes could be construed as intentions, and intentions could lead to the kind of punishment that served as warning to everyone else. So she had kept the dream to herself, pushing it down into the place where she stored all the thoughts and feelings that had no safe outlet. But now, sitting in the darkness with Ruth and Hannah, listening to the sounds of people trying to rest before another brutal day began, Clara found herself wondering about the dream's meaning. She did not believe in prophecy or supernatural messages. She had seen too much suffering go unanswered to imagine some benevolent force watching over their lives. Yet the dream had felt significant in a way she could not quite articulate, as though her sleeping mind had given form to something her waking thoughts could not safely acknowledge, a longing so deep and desperate that it could only express itself in images of total destruction. The next morning arrived with the same oppressive heat as the day before. Clara went through her usual routine, helping Esther in the kitchen, serving breakfast to the Thornhill family, cleaning and preparing for the midday meal. Master Edmund seemed more irritable than usual, snapping at his wife over some trivial matter, and leaving the table before he had finished eating. Through the kitchen door, Clara could hear him in his study, his voice raised as he spoke to someone about the cotton schedule and labor productivity. The words filtered through with harsh clarity. Lazy, insolent, need to be reminded of their place. Clara's hands tightened around the dish she was washing, but her face remained carefully blank. Around mid-morning, Thomas Thornhill came into the kitchen looking for cold water. He was tall like his father, with the same hard set to his jaw, but his eyes held a different quality, a kind of restless cruelty that seemed always to be looking for outlets. He took the water Clara poured for him and drank it quickly, then stood there studying her in a way that made her skin crawl. He asked if she had been working hard, if she was grateful for the comfortable position she held in the big house, rather than laboring in the fields. Clara murmured the expected responses, keeping her gaze lowered, knowing that eye contact could be interpreted as insolence or challenge. Thomas lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, making comments that seemed designed to provoke some reaction. He mentioned that his father was considering selling some of the house servants to cover debts, that Clara should be especially diligent in her work if she wanted to avoid being sent to the fields or sold away entirely. He said this casually as though discussing the weather, but Clara recognized the threat for what it was. A reminder that her entire existence rested on the whims of people who viewed her as property to be disposed of according to their convenience and profit calculations. When Thomas finally left, Esther caught Clara's eye and gave a slight shake of her head, a warning to let the anger go, to not let it show on her face or in her movements. Clara nodded almost imperceptibly and returned to her work, but inside she felt something hardening, calcifying into a determination she had not quite felt before. The dream from the previous night came back to her with renewed intensity, the flames consuming everything, the savage joy of watching the big house burn. She pushed the images away, but they lingered at the edges of her consciousness, refusing to be fully dismissed. The afternoon brought new tension to the plantation. One of the field hands, a man named Samuel, who was known for his quiet strength and steady work, collapsed in the cotton rows. The overseer ordered him to get up, and when Samuel could not immediately comply, the overseer began beating him with a leather strap. Other workers tried to help Samuel to his feet, but the overseer drove them back, shouting that anyone who stopped working would receive the same treatment. The scene played out within view of the big house, and Clara watched from a window as Samuel finally managed to stand and return to work, his movements slow and unsteady. That evening, as Clara walked back to the quarters, she felt the weight of accumulated indignities pressing down like the oppressive heat that never seemed to break. The dream of fire burned in her mind with new clarity, no longer just a random nightmare, but something that felt almost like a vision, a glimpse of a possibility that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The night of July 15th began like any other, with the quarters settling into their usual evening rhythms after another day of relentless labor under the Georgia sun. Clara sat outside with Ruth and Hannah, their conversation quieter than usual, weighted by the events of the afternoon. Samuel's collapse and beating had spread through the enslaved community like ripples in water, each person absorbing the message it sent, that their bodies were valued only for the work they could produce, that weakness would not be tolerated, that the masters felt their control slipping and were responding with increased brutality. Ruth spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. She said that her cousin on the neighboring plantation had sent word through the informal network of communication that connected enslaved people across the region. More owners were organizing patrols, implementing stricter curfews, and limiting movement between properties. The fear Mrs. Margaret had mentioned was spreading among the white population, fed by rumors and the fundamental understanding that their wealth and comfort rested on the backs of people who had every reason to hate them. Ruth's cousin had also mentioned increased incidents of small acts of resistance, tools going missing, equipment breaking at crucial moments, work slowing just enough to cause problems, but not enough to justify severe punishment. Hannah listened with her characteristic stillness, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When Ruth finished, Hannah spoke about her own years at Thornhill, about patterns she had observed over decades. She said that systems built on force and fear always contained the seeds of their own destruction. that people could be pushed only so far before something fundamental broke. She had seen it happen in small ways many times, a person who simply stopped caring about punishment, who chose defiance even knowing the cost. She had also seen the aftermath, the brutal examples made of those who refused to submit. But Hannah's voice carried a new note that evening, something Clara had never quite heard before, a suggestion that maybe, just maybe, the individual acts of resistance Ruth's cousin described were adding up to something larger, something that could not be suppressed by increased patrols and harsher punishments. Clara finally told them about her dream, the words coming slowly at first, then faster, as she described the flames consuming the big house, the heat on her face, the sound of destruction. She confessed the joy she had felt in the dream, the savage satisfaction of watching everything burn. Ruth and Hannah did not react with shock or condemnation. Instead, they nodded with understanding, acknowledging that such dreams came from somewhere deep and true, from a part of themselves that had to remain hidden during waking hours, but that still existed, still hungered for justice or revenge, or simply an end to endless suffering. The three women sat in silence after Clara finished speaking, each lost in her own thoughts. The night air remained thick and hot, offering no relief from the day's temperature. Cicadas sang their endless song, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked and was answered by another. The sounds created a familiar tapestry of plantation night, but underneath the surface familiarity, Clara sensed something different, some charge in the air that made her skin prickle with awareness. Around 10 o'clock, people began retreating to their rooms to try to sleep before the next day's labor began. Clara, Ruth, and Hannah went inside their small shared space, each woman settling onto her thin mattress. The room held the day's accumulated heat like an oven, making sleep difficult despite their exhaustion. Clara lay on her back, staring at the ceiling she could barely see in the darkness, her mind refusing to quiet. The dream of fire kept returning each time with more vivid details, the way flames climbed the white columns, the sound of glass shattering in windows, the collapse of the roof sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. She must have eventually fallen asleep because she woke suddenly to the sound of shouting outside. For a confused moment, she thought she was still dreaming. But then Ruth was shaking her shoulder, saying something urgent that Clara's sleep-fogged mind could not quite process. The smell hit her next. Smoke, sharp and acrid, nothing like the familiar scent of cooking fires or hearths. Clara sat up quickly, her heart pounding, and saw orange light flickering through the cracks in the wooden walls of their room. Ruth pulled open the door and they saw people running between the buildings, pointing toward the big house. Clara stepped outside and looked in the direction everyone was staring. The big house was burning. Flames poured from the ground floor windows, already climbing toward the second story, the fire spreading with terrifying speed through the dry summer wood. The white columns she had seen in her dream were being consumed by orange flames that seemed to reach toward the sky, hungry and unstoppable. The sound was exactly as she had imagined, a roar that drowned out everything else, punctuated by the crack and crash of things breaking and collapsing. People from the quarters stood frozen, watching the impossible scene unfold. No one moved to help, no one ran to fetch water or sound an alarm. They simply stood and watched as the symbol of their oppression burned. Clara felt Ruth's hand grip her arm tightly, felt Hannah move close to her other side. The three women stood together, their faces illuminated by flames that grew brighter with each passing moment, transforming night into a hellish orange day that revealed every detail with merciless clarity. The Thornhill family emerged from the burning house in various stages of panic and disarray. Master Edmund appeared first, dragging his wife by the arm, both of them coughing from smoke, their nightclothes disheveled. Elizabeth stumbled out next, screaming about her piano and her dresses, the material concerns of privilege persisting even in crisis. Thomas came last, pulling young William with him, both looking more angry than frightened, as though the fire represented a personal insult rather than a genuine threat to their lives. They gathered at a safe distance from the house, watching helplessly as the fire consumed everything they owned. The overseers arrived on horseback, summoned by the light of the flames visible for miles across the flat Georgia landscape. They immediately began shouting orders, demanding that the enslaved people form water lines to fight the fire. But the well stood too far from the house, and the fire had already grown too large. A few men made half-hearted efforts with buckets, more from self-preservation than any desire to save the master's property. If the fire spread to the quarters, their own lives would be at risk. But the wind blew in the opposite direction, carrying sparks and ash away from the enslaved people's buildings, as though nature itself had chosen sides in this disaster. Master Edmund's voice rose above the chaos, demanding to know how this had started, who was responsible, what had caused the fire to spread so quickly. His eyes scanned the crowd of enslaved people with growing suspicion, the fear Mrs. Margaret had mentioned now manifesting as rage and accusation. He ordered the overseers to gather everyone, to account for every person on the plantation, to find out who had been where when the fire started. The overseers moved through the crowd with their whips ready, herding people into groups, their faces hard with the same suspicion that drove their master. Clara stood with Ruth and Hannah, trying to control the trembling that had seized her body. The dream had come true. She had seen this exact scene in her sleep, the flames, the destruction, the orange light transforming everything. But dreams did not cause fires. Dreams were just the mind processing thoughts and fears and desires that could not be acknowledged during waking hours. Yet the coincidence felt impossible to dismiss, the timing too perfect, the details too exact. She felt Ruth's hand squeeze her arm again, a warning to stay calm, to show nothing on her face that could be interpreted as guilt or satisfaction. One of the overseers, a man named Cooper who was known for particular cruelty, began questioning people aggressively. He grabbed Samuel, the field hand who had collapsed the previous afternoon, and demanded to know where he had been when the fire started. Samuel, still weak from his ordeal, could barely answer, but Cooper pressed him harder, accusing him of setting the fire in revenge for his beating. Other enslaved people tried to speak up, saying Samuel had been in his room all evening, but Cooper ignored them, already convinced he had found his culprit. He dragged Samuel toward Master Edmund, announcing he had discovered the arsonist. Master Edmund's face in the firelight looked demonic, all shadows and harsh angles. He stared at Samuel with pure hatred, and Clara knew with sickening certainty that truth would not matter here. The masters needed someone to blame, needed to reassert control through punishment, needed to send a message that would terrify everyone else back into submission. Samuel's guilt or innocence was irrelevant to the function he would serve. Clara felt something rising in her chest, a scream or a protest, but Hannah's hand clamped down on her shoulder with surprising strength, holding her in place, silently commanding her to stay quiet, to not draw attention, to survive this night however she could. Thomas Thornhill stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. He demanded immediate punishment, saying they could not wait for proper authorities, that an example needed to be made immediately. His father nodded agreement, and the overseers began dragging Samuel toward a large oak tree that stood near the quarters. People in the crowd murmured, some crying out in protest, but the overseers had their weapons drawn now, making it clear that any interference would be met with violence. Clara watched in horror as they threw a rope over one of the oak's thick branches, as Samuel struggled weakly against the hands that held him, as the machinery of terror prepared to execute an innocent man. But then something unexpected happened. Old Esther stepped forward from the crowd, her voice clear and strong despite her years. She said that Samuel could not have started the fire because she had seen him in the quarters all evening. More importantly, she announced that she knew what had caused the fire, a candle in Master Edmund's study, left burning too close to the curtains. She had seen it earlier that evening when she brought him his nighttime brandy, had worried about it, but said nothing because enslaved people did not correct their master's carelessness. The fire had started from the master's own negligence, not from any act of rebellion or revenge. The overseers paused, uncertain. Master Edmund's face went from rage to confusion to something like fear. If the fire had been caused by his own carelessness, it meant he could not blame the enslaved population, could not use this disaster to justify increased brutality, could not frame this as an act of resistance requiring severe response. Thomas started to argue, saying Esther was lying to protect Samuel, but other house servants stepped forward to confirm her story about the candle. They had all seen it, had all worried about it, Had all remained silent because speaking up would have been interpreted as insolence. The moment stretched out. The only sound, the roar of the dying fire as the big house collapsed in on itself, sending up a shower of sparks that briefly illuminated every face with orange light. Clara could see the calculation happening in Master Edmund's eyes as he weighed his options. Finally, he ordered the overseers to release Samuel, but his voice carried a warning that everyone understood. This incident would not be forgotten, that scrutiny and suspicion would increase, that life on Thornhill Plantation was about to become even harder than before. The dawn of July 16th revealed the full extent of the destruction. Where the big house had stood, only blackened ruins remained, charred timbers jutting from piles of ash, the white columns reduced to crumbling fragments. Everything that had symbolized the Thornhill family's wealth and status transformed into smoking debris. The air smelled of burnt wood and melted metal, and a fine layer of ash covered everything within 100 yards of the ruins. The enslaved population gathered at a distance, staring at the devastation with carefully controlled expressions, each person aware that how they reacted to this disaster could determine their fate. Master Edmund stood among the ruins with his family, his face haggard from a sleepless night. Mrs. Margaret wept quietly, mourning the loss of her possessions, her comfortable life reduced to whatever could be salvaged from the ash. Elizabeth continued her complaints about lost dresses and jewelry, her voice shrill with outrage at the unfairness of it all. Thomas prowled the perimeter of the destruction like an angry dog, kicking at debris, his face set in an expression of barely controlled fury. Only young William remained quiet, watching everything with those knowing eyes that seemed to understand more than his years should allow. The overseers organized the enslaved people into work details, some sent to the fields to continue the never-ending cotton harvest, others assigned to begin clearing the debris and salvaging anything of value from the ruins. Clara found herself in a group tasked with sorting through what remained of the big house, looking for metal objects, intact dishes, anything that could be saved or sold. The work was hot and dirty, the ash coating her hands and face, getting into her eyes and throat despite the cloth she tied over her nose and mouth. As she worked, Clara overheard conversations between Master Edmund and neighboring plantation owners who had come to survey the damage and offer assistance. They spoke in low voices, but fragments carried on the morning breeze. One man suggested that Edmund had gotten off lucky, that fires often spread to the quarters and killed valuable property. Another mentioned insurance policies and the possibility of rebuilding with modern conveniences from the north. A third brought up the question everyone seemed to be dancing around, whether the fire had truly been an accident or something more sinister that Esther had covered up to prevent mass punishment. Master Edmund's response revealed his dilemma. If he insisted the fire was arson, he would have to admit he could not control his own enslaved population, which would damage his reputation among other owners and possibly affect the value of his property. If he accepted that the fire resulted from his own carelessness, he lost face but could claim the disaster was simply bad luck. Clara watched his face as he made the calculation, saw the moment he decided on the story he would tell. That the fire had been an unfortunate accident, a candle knocked over by a gust of wind through an open window, a tragedy, but not a crime. The decision meant Samuel's life was spared, at least for the moment, but it also meant that the tension on the plantation would remain high, that the master's fear and suspicion would continue to grow, that punishment for minor infractions would likely increase as they sought to reassert control through other means. Clara understood this instinctively, as did everyone else who had witnessed the previous night's events. The fire had changed something fundamental, had revealed fractures in the system that could not be easily repaired. Over the following days, a strange new routine emerged. The Thornhill family moved into a smaller building that had previously housed visiting family members, cramped and uncomfortable compared to their destroyed mansion, but still far more pleasant than the quarters where enslaved people lived. Master Edmund began making plans to rebuild, traveling to Savannah to meet with architects and contractors, discussing designs that would make the new house even grander than the one that had burned. The message was clear. The fire might have destroyed property, but it had not destroyed their power or their determination to maintain their way of life. Yet something had shifted in the atmosphere of the plantation. The enslaved population moved through their daily tasks with the same outward compliance as always, but underneath, Clara sensed a new current of possibility. The fire had shown that the seemingly permanent structures of their oppression could be destroyed, that the masters were not invincible, that disaster could strike even those who seemed untouchable. People whispered in the quarters at night, not about rebellion or resistance, but about the simple fact that change was possible, that the world was not as fixed as they had been taught to believe. Clara found herself thinking about the dream with new understanding. She had not caused the fire. That had been simple carelessness on Master Edmund's part, a candle left burning near fabric curtains on a hot, dry night. But the dream had prepared her for what happened, had given form to a longing so deep she could only acknowledge it in sleep. The dream had shown her that she could imagine a world without the big house, without the masters, without the daily terror and degradation. That act of imagination, she began to understand, was itself a form of resistance, a way of keeping some part of herself free, even when her body remained in chains. Ruth and Hannah noticed the change in Clara, the new quiet determination that replaced her previous careful neutrality. They did not speak of it directly, but their glances acknowledged what words could not safely express. The three women continued their evening conversations outside the quarters, talking about small things and practical matters, but underneath the surface discussions ran deeper currents of understanding. They were all waiting for something, though none of them could have said exactly what. They simply knew that the fire had opened a door in their minds, had shown them a glimpse of possibilities they had not dared to consider before. August arrived with no relief from the oppressive heat that had defined the summer of 1851. The cotton harvest continued its relentless pace, the work growing more desperate as Master Edmund pushed to make up for time lost to the fire and its aftermath. The ruins of the big house still stood like a memorial to destruction, waiting for the contractors and materials that would transform them into something new and supposedly better. But the rebuilding would take months, possibly years, and in the meantime, life on Thornhill Plantation continued in its transformed state, the old certainties replaced by new tensions and unspoken acknowledgments. Clara maintained her position working in the temporary house where the Thornhill family now lived, though the reduced circumstances meant fewer servants were needed. Several people who had worked in the big house found themselves reassigned to field work, a demotion that everyone understood as punishment for the collective suspicion that still lingered, despite the official story of accidental fire. Clara kept her head down, performed her duties with meticulous care, and tried to avoid drawing any attention that might lead to questions about her thoughts or dreams, or the strange coincidence of having envisioned fire the night before it happened. But she could not stop thinking about what the fire had revealed. The masters lived in constant fear, she now understood, fear that was masked by brutality and control, but that remained always present beneath the surface. They feared the people they enslaved because they knew on some fundamental level that their entire way of life rested on a foundation of injustice that could not be sustained indefinitely. Every act of cruelty was also an admission of weakness, every increase in surveillance a confession that their power was more fragile than they pretended. This understanding changed something in how Clara moved through her days. She began to notice small acts of resistance everywhere. The field hand who worked just slowly enough to frustrate the overseers without quite justifying punishment, the cook who served food that was technically adequate but lacking in the quality the masters had come to expect, the groom who allowed horses to go slightly longer between groomings than strict efficiency required. None of these acts alone amounted to rebellion, but together they represented a constant low-level refusal to give more than the absolute minimum required to avoid severe punishment. Clara also noticed information flowing through the quarters with increasing sophistication. Ruth's cousin continued to send news from neighboring plantations, and that news was shared carefully among trusted people, creating a network of knowledge that the masters could not fully monitor or control. She learned about successful escapes on other properties, about abolitionists working in the North to end slavery, about tensions between different regions of the country over the question of whether new territories would allow enslaved labor. The information arrived in fragments, often distorted or incomplete, but it painted a picture of a larger world where the institution that defined their existence was being questioned and challenged. One evening in late August, as Clara sat outside with Ruth and Hannah, old Esther joined them. This was unusual. Esther rarely left her room after finishing her work in the kitchen, preferring solitude to socializing. But tonight she settled onto the bench beside Hannah and spoke in her quiet, measured way about what she had witnessed over 4 decades at Thornhill. She talked about the small ways things had changed, how certain practices that were common when she arrived were now less acceptable, how some owners were beginning to worry about northern criticism, even as they insisted on their right to maintain their property as they saw fit. Esther said something that night that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. She said that she had lived long enough to understand that change came slowly and often invisibly, accumulating in tiny increments until suddenly what had seemed permanent and unchangeable revealed itself to be temporary and fragile. The fire had been an accident, yes, but it had also been a symbol, a demonstration that even the most solid-seeming structures could be reduced to ash and memory. And while individual people might not live to see the end of slavery, might not experience freedom in their own lifetimes, the system itself carried the seeds of its own destruction, would inevitably collapse under the weight of its own contradictions and cruelties. The 4 women sat in silence after Esther finished speaking, listening to the familiar sounds of plantation night, cicadas and distant dogs and children's voices, and the rustle of wind through leaves. Clara felt something settling in her chest, a kind of quiet resolve that replaced the desperate anger she had carried for so long. She understood now that her dream of fire had not been prophecy or supernatural vision, but rather her mind's way of processing truths she could not safely acknowledge while awake. The dream had shown her that she could imagine destruction, could picture a world without masters, could hold on to hope even in circumstances designed to crush it. The summer of 1851 ended as it had begun, with oppressive heat and endless labor and the daily indignities of enslavement. The Thornhill plantation continued its operations, the cotton was harvested and sold, and plans proceeded for rebuilding the big house. Master Edmund's insurance paid out, and he used the money to design an even larger mansion, one that would demonstrate to everyone that the fire had not diminished his wealth or status. The construction would take 2 years to complete, and during that time, the charred ruins remained visible to everyone on the plantation, a reminder of what had been lost and what might someday be lost again. Clara continued her work in the temporary house, moving through her days with the same careful performance of compliance that had allowed her to survive this long. But inside, something had fundamentally changed. She had learned that imagination itself was a form of freedom, that the ability to envision a different world was the first step toward creating one. She had learned that the master's power rested on nothing more solid than force and fear, and that such foundations were inherently unstable. She had learned that small acts of resistance, multiplied across hundreds of people over years and decades, could shift the ground beneath even the most seemingly permanent systems. The dream of fire stayed with her, not as a frightening vision, but as a reminder that change was possible, that structures built by human hands could be unmade by human hands, that nothing was as eternal as it pretended to be. And on the nights when the weight of her circumstances threatened to crush her spirit, when the endless days of labor and humiliation seemed unendurable, Clara would remember the orange flames climbing the white columns, remember the sound of destruction, remember the fierce joy of watching everything burn. The memory sustained her, gave her strength to continue, whispered that she was more than what they tried to make her, that her dreams belonged to her even if her body did not, that somewhere in the future, maybe not in her lifetime but someday, the fire she had imagined would become real in ways she could not predict, and the world would be transformed by flames that no amount of water could extinguish. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge. and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.